Anytime you share your work, you should always be ready to receive feedback from team members. Feedback means asking for or receiving ideas about what is or isn't working. Good feedback helps to come up with new questions or ideas that you might not have thought about before. This can help you find ways to improve your work. Earlier in the certificate program, you learned about self-reflection. It's important for UX designers to understand their personal values and any biases they might have because of the influence it can have on your designs. In the same way, it's a good idea to reflect on how much feedback you are giving and receiving at each stage of a project. You might ask yourself, am I comfortable sharing my opinions about another designer's project? And, am I checking in regularly with team members to get feedback on my designs? If the answer is yes to both of these questions, then you're off to a great start. There's lots of advantages to asking for design feedback regularly. First, feedback helps you improve your designs and become a better designer. Your teammates can offer ideas or suggestions that you might not have considered before. Second, feedback can build your confidence and skills. Getting continual feedback helps build your confidence because you'll recognize how you've improved over time. And the more feedback you get, the more you will improve your skills. Finally, feedback helps broaden your perspective as a designer. Ideally, you'll work with people with different sets of skills and backgrounds, and they will be able to identify opportunities for you to improve your design that you may have missed. Receiving feedback from a diverse audience is the goal, because our personal biases inform what we create. New perspectives can help mitigate bias in your design and offer additional ways to solve for challenges. It can also help you consider experiences unique to users other than those you initially imagined. I like to think of feedback as a gift, because it helps me think more deeply and broadly about my designs. Of course, receiving feedback about your work can be difficult at times. But it's a critical part of the design iteration process. Keep in mind, you won't always be the one receiving feedback. Sometimes you give the feedback. And giving feedback can also be difficult. Let me share a few tips on how to give great feedback as a UX designer. First, when giving feedback, it should be adjusted for each situation. Think about the role of the person you're giving feedback to, whether they're an engineer, project manager, or fellow designer. You should also think about the experience level of the person you're giving feedback to, whether they're a fellow newbie like you or more senior. Second, you should have a reason to support your feedback. For example, if you give feedback about a specific part of a project that you feel isn't working, you should be ready to explain why you think it isn't working. Broad feedback such as, "I don't like the color you chose," is not helpful. On the other hand, if you share, "I don't like the color you chose because it's not accessible," then you're explaining your reasoning and providing the designer an actionable improvement. Third, you should describe problems with the design, not offer solutions. As a designer, it may be tempting to provide advice on how you think the design should look or feel. But put yourself in the other person's shoes. Would you want another designer telling you how to fix things? Or would you want an opportunity to take their feedback, process it, and come up with your own solutions to the problems? These 3 suggestions are just the beginning. You can learn many more tips for giving feedback in the course reading. One more thing, before you go off into the real world and have to give and receive feedback. Let me tell you a little bit about my own journey with feedback in my career. The first time I received design critiques was in architecture school. Often, I felt defensive and uncomfortable when I had to present my work to professors or peers. I also felt frustrated when I'd incorporate their feedback only to have my decisions questioned again in the next round of feedback. With practice, time, and reflection, I started to value the critiques and understand that I didn't always have to follow all the feedback or advice. Most importantly, I became more confident in my own design decisions. In my current role as an interaction designer, I asked for feedback early in the process and as often as possible. Feedback has helped me learn from colleagues and improve my work over time. I hope feedback will do the same for you. As you might have noticed, in the world of UX design, we give a lot of feedback. Coming up, we'll discuss a method of giving feedback frequently used in UX design called design critiques. Last time, we explored how feedback offers fresh perspectives that can help you improve your designs. Now, let's discuss a common type of feedback activity for UX designers. It's called a design critique session. A design critique session is a planned period of time where UX designers present their work to team members and listen to feedback. Design critiques are also a great opportunity for you to practice giving feedback to other team members. These sessions are a chance for many people to come together to exchange ideas and make a collective choice on a design direction, in person or remotely. When you hear the phrase design critique session, you might picture yourself showing up in front of a group of people and waiting to receive comments about your performance. You might even imagine defending yourself from an army of team members. Fortunately, that's not the case. If design critique sessions are planned with clear objectives and good preparation, they can be very useful. Plus, they can even improve the ways you and your team work together in the future. So, what does a crit session look like in the real world? Let's start with the participants. In a design critique, participants can play one of three main roles: facilitator, presenter, or reviewer. First, there's the facilitator. Their job is to run the crit session and guide the process. They might also monitor the time and make sure that the objectives are being followed. On top of that, they'll make sure that everyone's voice is included and that there's enough time for all ideas to be shared. Keep in mind, not every design critique needs to be run by a facilitator. The second role is the presenter. This is the designer who is sharing their work with others in the session. If you're the presenter, you need to prepare beforehand, be actively engaged, and be ready to ask questions for clarification after feedback is given. The final role is the reviewer or critic. The reviewer gives feedback about the design and offers clear actions to take. There is usually more than one reviewer in a design critique. At some point in your UX design career, you'll have an opportunity to be in each of these roles. That's why it's important to know how all three of the roles work together during a design critique. One more thing. There might sometimes be a fourth role, a note taker. This person can capture all of the ideas and feedback from the reviewers, so that the presenter can stay fully present and focused. So, how do these roles work together in a crit session? There's not one right way, and a design critique session can follow lots of different structures. To give you an idea, here is one structure that a design critique session might follow. First, the facilitator provides an overview of the design critique session and defines the objectives. The objectives tell the participants the goals of the design critique. Ideally, objectives are specific and time-bound. For example, the objective of a design critique session might be to get initial feedback on the mockups for the booking process in our dog walker app. Next, the presenter shares their design work. As they present their designs, reviewers begin to jot down their feedback in the form of questions, ideas, likes, or challenges. After that, the facilitator lets the reviewers take turns explaining their feedback. At this time, the presenter can ask clarifying questions and thoughtfully respond to the feedback. Finally, the facilitator wraps up the crit session. Part of the wrap-up includes the facilitator asking any questions tied to the objectives that may not have already been covered. All right, now you know the different roles you might have in a critique session and how a design critique session should be structured. Up next, we'll discuss making the most of a critique session when you are presenting your own designs. A design critique session can't happen without a presenter to share their work. In this video, we'll focus on making the most of a crit session when you're the presenter. As the presenter, preparation is key. You're responsible for creating a brief presentation to share with everyone who's attending the crit session. The most important part of this presentation is the design itself. When you prepare your presentation for the design critique session, you should be ready to discuss the thinking behind any of your design decisions. It can be helpful to focus on these 5 questions. Who are you designing for? What problem are you trying to solve? How are your designs solving or not solving these problems? Where in the design process are you? And what aspects of your designs are you seeking feedback on? Thinking critically about these questions will help you remember the most important aspects of your design to focus on when presenting. These questions will also help the reviewers stay focused on the areas that you need feedback on. One more thing you need to keep in mind as you prepare to present. You need to provide reviewers with enough information to give feedback on. You also need to keep in mind how long the session will be, and if the reviewers will have enough time to understand your designs. If you have a complex prototype, you may want to send it to reviewers in advance of the session. Okay, so you're fully prepared for the presentation. Now, it's time for the crit session itself. Let's explore a few best practices for presenters during a crit session. First, take in the feedback and decide if you want to ask for clarification or respond. You'll also have time after the session to think about how and when to take action based on the feedback you received. Second, it's important to focus on active listening. It's not easy to hear comments about things that we're not doing right. You might even become defensive or want to give an explanation. Instead, you should focus on listening and asking questions to help better understand the reviewer's point of view. Finally, you should be ready to take action on the feedback after the session. In most design critique sessions, there can be multiple reviewers and multiple parts of your design that they're critiquing. So be prepared to receive lots of comments. After you have a chance to think about all of the feedback you've received, you can decide if your design will stay the course or change direction. Think of your work as a boat, and you're the captain. In a design critique session, the feedback helps you understand if the boat's moving in the right direction, or if you need to change direction in small or big ways. As a new designer, critique sessions helped me identify different perspectives to consider design problems from. They also helped me learn new skills and develop my own critical eye for design. Regular feedback is a key part of every designer's process. Feedback has helped me improve my work, as well as my personal skills. Okay, you now understand how a design critique session works and the role the presenter plays. Let's keep learning about critique sessions. We're moments away from checking out an example of a crit session in action. A standard design critique session is at least 30 minutes, and the designer usually spends 5 to 10 of those minutes presenting. But keep in mind, the session length will depend on the amount of feedback requested and the number of reviewers involved. We don't have time to share a full crit session with you, so the upcoming video is just a snapshot of what usually happens. In the mock crit session, I'll play the role of the presenter, sharing some of the mockups for the Dogwalker app with 2 colleagues, who are the reviewers. There will also be a facilitator guiding the flow of the interaction. While you've been working on your mockups throughout this course, so have I. The mockups I'll present in the design critique session are my current iteration of the Dogwalker app. As the presenter, I'll ask for feedback on 2 parts of this design: the scheduling flow and the call to action buttons. Remember, call to action buttons are elements in a design that tell the user to take action. In the Dogwalker app, the call to action buttons are labeled things like book appointment and next. You'll have a chance to watch how the flow of ideas and communication happens as I present my work and receive feedback. As you watch, take note of how I, as the presenter, respond to the feedback I'm receiving. Ask yourself, is the presenter actively listening? Is the presenter taking notes? What types of follow-up questions is the presenter asking? You should also focus on the way that reviewers share their feedback and opinions. Ask yourself, do the reviewers share the reasoning behind their feedback? Do the reviewers focus on problems with the design instead of offering solutions? Do the reviewers connect their feedback to the objectives of the design critique session? With these questions in mind, let's join the crit session.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining the design critique today. I'm Michael, and today Kunal is presenting his designs for the Dogwalker app, and he has some questions about the core flow. For the reviewers, please feel free to take notes while Kunal is presenting, and please save your questions until the end of the presentation. Go ahead, Kunal.
Thanks, Michael. I'd like to present the current state to you all and get your feedback, especially about the call to action buttons and scheduling flow. So let's start going through the scheduling flow. Here on the home screen, the main call to action is to book an appointment. I thought about placing it inside the hero, but I like the idea of having the button divide that space from the nearby dog walkers. Tapping the button opens up the scheduling flow. And to make it clear to users that there's a sequence of steps to go through, I've added a stepper or progress tracker with 3 icons across the top of the screen. Also, I wanted large, rounded call to action buttons on every page of the app. I tried to keep that style consistent for all of the buttons. Okay, back to the scheduling flow. The first step is to set up the appointment details. There's a number of things to input here, like the date, time, and duration, as well as selecting which dogs are being walked. For the UI design, I chose a carousel menu that the user can scroll through to decide the date, time, and length of the walk for their dog. I've also added an option to make this a recurring appointment, but I'm still working through designing the screens for that step. You can probably tell that I chose the same rounded buttons with the same orange color to book appointments, advance to the next screen while booking, and finally to book the appointment. I also made the choice to have the date, dog walker, and confirm icons in the same color too. As each one of these steps is completed, that icon turns to orange in a circle. These are the steps of the user journey within the app so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Kunal, for presenting your designs. Shabi and Salvador, do you guys have any questions?
Thank you, Kunal. My first thought is that I like the flow of the pages, and I noticed that there's an option for choosing recurring sessions. But in the second panel, are we using language that appeals to the most users? How about something like which dog is being walked instead of who is going for a walk?
I agree. And what if the user has more than one dog, but those dogs have separate walking schedules? I know that my dog Ranger is not very social, so I would like to have him go for a walk alone instead of with other dogs. Is this a feature that we can build into the app? It seems like at this point, the app only serves one type of user.
Thank you. Those are great questions and suggestions. I'll explore some different copy options and check with the team about requesting walks for solo dogs. But like you said, I'm not sure the app supports that feature right now.
Oh, and one more thing. I noticed the scheduling step lists multiple dogs, and some of the language seems to imply this too. For example, the homepage uses the phrase, "we can take them for a walk." So I'm wondering how a single dog view could be incorporated into the app design. I'm also wondering if we will actually need the list of dog names to select from for users who only have a single dog.
That's a great question, Salvador. I'll go back to the mockup later and find out if I can make any changes to the interface to support users with one dog. That seems like a pretty common situation for a lot of our potential users.
Great. Thank you, Kunal, for presenting those points. We've heard a lot about the scheduling flow, so let's move on to the call to action buttons. Or maybe, do you have some questions for the reviewers, Kunal?
Thanks. No, I don't have any questions for now. So as I explained earlier, we decided to go with the color orange for the call to action buttons. I'd like to get your impression about the overall button styles.
I like the choice of the rounded buttons, but what was your reasoning behind the decision to use orange for the call to action buttons? And does this shade of orange affect the accessibility for the user? There's also a whole lot of orange on some of the pages. So I'm also wondering, since orange is a color for the main call to action buttons, should we simplify the date, dog walker, and confirmation icons across the top of the pages? Maybe you could change the color of those to gray or something more neutral instead of orange.
Good questions. I chose a medium shade of orange based on the color guide set up in the design system. In terms of accessibility, I will have to investigate the color contrast. I'll be sure to make any necessary changes to the color palette to make it accessible for all users.
Thank you, Kunal. Any other questions before we go on?
I have one more question. The placement and width for the main call to action buttons seem to change on the pages throughout the scheduling flow. Does changing the position and size of the buttons create distractions for the user?
We scale the buttons to emphasize them, and then we change the size of the buttons on each panel to be in proportion with the other buttons on the page. So these changes shouldn't interrupt the flow.
Okay, thanks for that, Kunal. Would either of you like to add anything else before we continue?
I like the choice of white for the text and a call to action buttons, but maybe you should consider.
You just watched part of a design critique session. What did you think? I hope you're able to learn how UX designers, like me, present work, and receive feedback. You also got a chance to observe how reviewers provide feedback in this critique session format. In this video, we'll discuss what happens after a design critique session. If you are the presenter, like I was, it's time to process all of the feedback from reviewers. The goal is to decide which suggestions to incorporate or not, and work on generating action items. Start by reviewing the notes that you, or a note taker, took during the critique session. As you review the notes, it's also helpful to take some time to really think about the feedback you received. Ask yourself, how can I synthesize the feedback from the design critique session? Then, what feedback do I want to take action on to improve my designs or the user experience? So, let's evaluate the feedback I received and identify some actions I might want to take to improve my work. As we go along, I might also think of some follow-up questions for the reviewers to clarify the feedback they provided. I'm going to pull up the designs I presented to Xabi and Salvador on the Schedule a Dog Walker user flow. I'm also going to review my notes to remind myself of the feedback they provided. One thing to keep in mind: since there were only 2 reviewers in this critique session, there's less synthesis that I need to do. Remember when you synthesized participant feedback from the usability study in an earlier course with Jason? In the same way, if you have multiple reviewers in a large design critique session, you will probably need to synthesize the feedback and identify themes. In this case, since I only have 2 reviewers, I'll get started with the first note I took. Oh yes, I remember this one. Xabi recommended changing the wording of the question the user is asked when choosing which dog will be walked. This feedback from Xabi wasn't supported by any specific design principles. Xabi also didn't explain how changing this question would impact the user experience or the functionality of the app. With this in mind, I'm going to interpret this piece of feedback as a suggestion that's nice to have, but not something I must fix. So for this piece of feedback, I'm going to say there's no action needed. Now, let's move on to the next piece of feedback in my notes. This one's from Salvador about the same part of the design. Salvador shared a useful perspective about users who have dogs with different walking schedules or need to go for a walk alone. To figure out if I should implement this suggestion, I'll need to talk to the product manager and my teammate in operations. Their insights about whether or not this option is practical will help guide any iterations of the design. Keep in mind, this happens a lot during critique sessions. You might get feedback that impacts more than just the design. So, the action item here is to email the product manager I work with in order to set up a meeting and determine if this is a change we want to implement. On to the next one. Salvador asked what the experience would entail if the user has only one dog. Salvador's question is useful because it's user-centered and aimed at creating options for a possible solution. We expect the app to support users with 1 or more dogs, so I probably need to create more screens to understand the user flow for single dog owners. I'll take an action item to create more screens for the dog selection part of the user flow. Okay, let's go on to the next point I recorded during the critique session. Salvador asked about the different sizes of the call to action buttons. I'll use this as an opportunity to check the size specifications of my mockups in Figma. In this case, there are 2 actions I need to take. First, I want to check all of my mockups to make sure the buttons are the same height and width. And second, I will review the placement of the buttons across all of the screens I've created. On to the next piece of feedback. Xabi had 2 comments. To address this feedback, I'll need to spend some time iterating on the icon design and the accompanying text labels that are shown across the top of the screen. This is also a place where I have a follow-up question for Xabi to clarify the feedback she provided. I want to ask if she meant simplifying the colors of the icons, or the text labels beneath the icons, or both. And the next piece of feedback I wrote down was from Xabi too. It was about the shade of orange I used in the call to action buttons. She asked whether or not the color is accessible. This is really important feedback. I need to make sure that my designs work for all users with various abilities. Based on this feedback, I need to check if the color contrast passes accessibility standards. If the orange on the white background is not accessible, I will need to change the color of the buttons and icons that I used throughout the booking flow. For example, I might need to change to a darker shade of orange. Alright, those are all of the notes I captured from the design critique session. These are just a few examples of the many types of interactions that can happen between reviewers and the designer who is presenting. Over time, you'll gain more and more confidence with the process of receiving or giving feedback. You'll also develop more strategies about how to take useful feedback and generate action items to keep improving your design. Coming up, we'll cover some of the steps involved in integrating these action items into your mockups in Figma. Earlier, you checked out an example design critique session. Then, we discussed some strategies about how to take feedback and use it to generate action items to improve your designs. In this video, I'll use the feedback from the design critique to make a few updates to my mockups. As a reminder, here are the 5 items I decided to take action on. Create more screens for the dog selection part of the user flow. Make sure the buttons are the same heights and widths. Review the placement of the buttons. Iterate on icon design across the top of the screen. And check if the color contrast passes accessibility standards. Let's get started with the first action item, which is creating more screens for the dog selection part of the user flow. As you might remember, Salvador asked what the user experience would entail if the user has only one dog. To address this, I iterated on my designs right away. I created alternative versions of a few screens that show the user flow for single dog owners. Let me show you one of them. Before, on the book appointment screen, there were 3 dog names listed, and the user had to select at least one. Now, my new additional screens, like this one, show only one dog name, and it's automatically selected. This will save the user time. Now, onto the second action item. Make sure the buttons are the same heights and widths. I did a detailed check of every button of the Schedule a Dog Walker user flow in Figma. Almost all of the buttons were the same heights and widths, except for one, so I made a quick adjustment. The third action item was to review the placement of the buttons. The good news is that all of my related buttons, like the next button, were already at the same X and Y axis of the grid. You might be wondering how I check this. To check for placement in Figma, I can click on a button, like the next button, and check the right side panel to see where it's positioned on the screen. The next button should have an X value of 16 and Y value of 8 to indicate that the button is in the same place across screens. The fourth action item was to iterate on the 3 icon designs across the top of the screen. Shabby suggested that I review these icons because it looked a bit busy. I did a few rounds of iteration on this part of my mockup to figure out how to address this feedback. Keep in mind that some of the feedback you might receive can take time to implement in your designs, but that's just part of the process. In the earlier version of my design, the 3 icons across the top of the screen were each surrounded by a circle and had accompanying text labels beneath them. Now, the icons stand alone without circles and without accompanying text labels. This new iteration of my design looks cleaner and less busy. Finally, the fifth action item was to check the shade of orange that's used throughout my design to see if the color contrast passes accessibility standards. WebAIM, which stands for Web Accessibility in Mind, allows you to check the contrast between 2 colors and compare them against WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guideline Standards. After checking the color contrast on WebAIM, I decided to use a darker shade of orange for the color palette in my app. This darker shade passes AAA accessibility, so it's a more inclusive choice for app users. The suggested hex value for the updated orange is D53E0B. I'll make this change to the buttons in all screens of my mockup. For example, you can see the change in the color from a lighter shade of orange to a darker shade on the buttons here. I'll also change the color to this darker shade of orange in my sticker sheet. To save myself time in the future, I'll update the color of the buttons, icons, the review stars, and text. Here's a pro tip. You don't need to change the color of each button individually. If you hold and drag your cursor to select all of the buttons and icons in the sticker sheet, you can simply change the color in the right side panel. Look for the header called Selection Colors and edit your style color. Okay, we've made it through the 5 action items from the design critique session feedback. And with that, you've learned how to take feedback from a design critique session and use it to make practical changes to your designs in Figma. Now it's your turn to iterate on your own mockups based on feedback.
Congratulations on finishing this course from the Google UX Design Certificate. You can access the full experience, including job search help, and start to earn your certificate by clicking on the icon or the link in the description below. Watch the next video in the course by clicking here, and subscribe to our channel for more from upcoming Google Career Certificates.